Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Masterclass in Library Impact, Quantifying the Humanities Research Impact of Your Academic Library, which is sponsored by Gale, part of Cengage Group. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speaker. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom panel of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version and where to access today's slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Kevin.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are super excited about today's presentation, and just to introduce it mostly, Mike Thelwall will be doing most of the presentation today. We are using this opportunity with Choice ACRL's platform to really share some information about some recent studies that impact reports that Mike has done on our Times Digital Archives and 18th Century Collections Online resources. And just to give you a little background, Mike Thelwall, who is joining us today, he is a professor of data science in the School of Information and Journalism and Communication. He is a awarded scientometrics and bibliometrics scholar, and he is currently involved in several international studies on various international projects on scientific misinformation, and is a master of all things scientometrics and bibliometrics. We're really excited to have him here today to share some of his methodology for doing these recent impact studies, and how you can maybe take some of what he's done and apply it to at your university to maybe kind of get some more tell more stories about the impact of humanities resources at the library. We can go to the next slide, I think. So just to get more information on the background of what Mike is talking about today, we have, you can download the impact studies that Mike is going to show, the research that he's done on these impact studies, kind of the methodology behind them. You can download them at gale.com/research impact. And then also just wanted to mention, we have the 18th Century Collections Online, which is mentioned, and the research impact of the collection is will be discussed today, and kind of how Mike has revealed that impact. The part 3 of that collection is forthcoming. It will be launching in March 2026, and we have trials that will be coming in the fall. So you can get more info about that at gale.com/ECCO-III. So you can check out that at gale.com as well for more information on ECCO 3. And with that, I can hand it over to Mike to get underway with his presentation. And if you guys we'll hold questions till the end. If you have those, you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll have a time for a Q&A at the end of today's session. So, and thank you again, Mike, for joining us. And I will hand it over to you.
Oh, Mike, I think you're
muted. There we go. Oh,
thank you. That's a good start.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, Sabrina. So I'm honored to be here, and and I'm hoping to give an interesting talk about quantifying humanities research impact of digital resources in your academic library. So I'm going to give a talk in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to describe a 6-step method to trace the impacts of diverse digital resources from your library. And then I'm going to give 2 case studies, one of the time 1775 to 1785, in fact, to 1985, and the other case study of 18th century collections online. So it's first a general method that you could adapt to whatever digital resources you're interested in, and then 2 specific case studies that illustrate 2 different ways of applying the method. So it's going to be, I'm going to analyze and describe the method at a fairly general level, with examples rather than going into the detailed step by step for applying the method. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me afterwards, or as well as putting the questions in the Q&A session. Okay, so first off, the 6-step method. So what's this all about? So the goal is tracing the impacts of diverse digital resources from your library. So a little bit of background context. So if you've got digital resources in your library, you can probably have the ability to count how often they're downloaded, either all together or individually, but that doesn't tell you anything about how they're used. So you don't know who's using them, you don't know why they're using them, you don't know how valuable they are being. So that isn't helpful if you want to judge the real value of these resources. So another bit of background. So if you have a journal collections in your library, I'm sure you do, then you can identify the use context of these with citation analysis. So this is an established technique that's been going for over half a century, which we can use to track how a journal is used, how the articles in the journal are used, by tracking the citations to them. And there are many bibliometric databases that you can use to do that, such as the Web of Science, Scopus, Dimensions, and OpenAlex. And these are all set up to make this relatively easy to do. So if you had a humanities journal and you wanted to track the impact of that journal, then any one of these databases would do it really well for you, as long as the journal is included in the database. But that's not what we're doing. We're not looking at journal articles. We're looking at diverse digital resources. And these are harder to analyze for their use context, and not just the number of downloads, but the context in which they're used, because the citation databases aren't set up for them. They're primarily designed for journal articles. Sometimes they have some books in, usually limited numbers of books, but they're not designed for other resources, other digital resources. So things like newspapers, digitized primary document sources, data repositories, government repositories, the databases are not designed for them. So for this talk, I'm going to describe methods to use the citation analysis techniques that are well suited to journals and apply them to other digital resources. Okay, so 6-step method, step 1. So step 1 is perhaps an unexpected one. It's select what you're going to analyze. And this is important because you might have a large collection of resources, some of which just can't be analyzed because they're not cited in a way that's distinctive enough that you can find them without doing an enormous amount of filtering work on the results. So the first step, if you have a large set of resources, would be to identify if and how many documents you've got that you can search for citations to them. So an example would be, a good example would be Cleves Weekly Police Gazette. So that's got a really distinctive title. So you can, if anyone mentions Cleves Weekly Police Gazette, then it's not going to be anything else other than this odd newspaper from the 19th century. But if you're looking for citations to a newspaper called The News, you're going to be really in a lot of trouble because it's such a general phrase. So if it's possible, it's good to start with accepting that it's going to be too difficult to identify the use cases of some of the documents you've got if their titles are just too general, or they have no other identifiers that are used to search for them. So, okay, so step 2 and step 3. So these are 2 alternative steps, and this is really the heart of the method. So step 2 is if you've got a periodical title, so this is for a collection where the objects, the documents in the collection come from one or a small number of periodicals, like a newspaper or old journals. So they all have a common title. So here, if there is a database that indexes the name of the periodical, then you can do a periodical title search in that database. So you need to check all the databases that you can find to see if there's one that does index the title. And then if the title is indexed, what that means is you can search specifically for that title, and then you'll get results that are relatively accurate to that title. So behind the scenes, what that means is that the database has designed an algorithm to match citations to that title in a way that it's probably taken them a long time, and saves you the work of having to do the same to do this job. So if you don't have periodicals, or none of the databases index the periodical title, so this is a little bit hit and miss, as we'll see with one of the case studies, then strategy 3 is to use Scopus and the cited reference search in Scopus. So Scopus has a range of cited reference searches, and this allows you to directly search the reference lists of the documents indexed by Scopus. And this works not just for journals, but for any type of digital resource. Anything that's mentioned in a reference list or footnotes, you can search for them by title, by identifier, or by anything that's unique to the document, or nearly unique to the documents that you're looking for. So this has the advantage that it's relatively general, so it should work to some extent for everything. But this disadvantage that you're probably going to need to submit lots of these searches, one per document that you've got. And you might get quite a few false matches if you have documents with relatively short titles. So you'll get too many hits because the short title will match longer titles or phrases in other documents. So if you're using step 3, then you need to use a little bit of trial and error to work out which documents you can search for in the reference list this way, and also designing searches that don't have too many false matches. So this is the librarian job you're doing, really, designing an effective query to match your documents. So I won't go on about that, because I think you're probably better at doing this than me. Okay, so the next 3 steps, the final 3 steps. So step 4 is getting all the results. So we've designed the queries. Now we need to get all the results. So if you have only a few queries, then you can submit them manually in the interface of whichever database you're using. If you've got moderately many queries, you can sometimes customize the queries so you can submit them in batches in the web interface, and I'll show an example of that later. But if you've really got an enormous amount of queries, then you'll need to submit them automatically. So with Scopus, you can submit queries automatically with, they have something called an applications programming interface, which allows you to write a computer program that will submit queries, and it will record save the results to your computer. So I'll say a little bit about that later, but not too much, in case there are people that don't like programming. So it's my favorite thing. So if I start talking about it, I'll never stop. So step 5 is checking the results to filter out the false matches. So at this stage, you might get an unpleasant surprise that some of the searches that you've submitted, some of the queries, have returned many false matches. So step 5 is filtering those out. And then step 6 is just the reporting step. So the types of information you might want to report might be just lists of citations. So a simple list might be what you're after, or you might want to summarize the information in the citations, such as which countries they come from, which subjects they cover, which journals they come from, which authors they come from. So this is the standard kind of information that you'll get from a bibliometric analysis that you can include. And for humanities resources, what I think is by far the most interesting thing to do, so I'll focus mainly on that in the case studies, is look at the context in which the resources have been cited. So this is quite time consuming because it means you have to identify individually for each citing document exactly what they've cited, and then read the document, find and read the document to see the reason why the resource has been cited specifically. And I'll give some examples of that. So if you've got an interesting resource collection, then you might spend, like me, ages and ages and ages doing this just because it's a lot of fun. And then finally, with the results, it's just important to be humble with your claims in the results, in the sense that whatever method you use is not going to find 100% of the valid citations or uses. So it might even be quite a small percentage if your resources are rarely cited in a very standard way. So you shouldn't think of this as something that captures all the uses, but it's useful to give you an idea of the types of uses of the resources. So roughly where it's used and a range of reasons why the resource is used. Okay, so that's the method, 6-step method. And I'm going to go through 2 examples of using the method, 2 case studies. So the first case study is the times between 1785 and 1985. So for this case study, so the objective was to find out who cites the Times newspaper between 1785 and 1985, so in terms of which subject areas, which universities, and why it's cited. Why do people cite the Times? And for this, the Times is really an absolute nightmare title for a journal. So because it's just too general. So when Gale first asked me if this was possible, I think my initial reply was not very likely, but I will double check. And luckily, when I double checked, it was possible with the Web of Science. So this is uses one of the 2 approaches that I've mentioned. And this works because the Web of Science indexes the Times as a specific title. So it has software that specifically looks for citations to the Times London newspaper. So this is an illustration of one of the problems with identifying Times stories. So I searched for my own name in the Gale search interface because I'm not vain at all. And this is an example of a Times newspaper story that has no title. So early versions of the Times just didn't have a title for most of the stories. It just columns and columns of paragraphs, each paragraph being a story. So these are a complete nightmare to cite because there's nothing really to cite but the page, the year. But later on, the Times news stories did have a title. So from the 20th century, most news stories had a specific title, so they were easier to cite by title. Probably no author, but title and page and issue. So this was one of the funnier news stories that I found, which was complaining that girls were hanging about the military bases during World War I to the extent that the commanders were considering taking the soldiers on route marches from 8 o'clock till midnight to make sure that they didn't get the chance to talk to girls, which seems a little bit extreme. Okay, so just going through the logic of picking the Web of Science. So I tried OpenAlex and I searched for the Times in OpenAlex, and you can see from the results here these aren't the Times. So I couldn't find the Times as a newspaper as a cited source in OpenAlex, so it wouldn't be easy to get citations to the Times from OpenAlex. So OpenAlex is a free database. And this is Scopus, so searching for the source title, The Times, in Scopus. So this got too many matches, 148,000, and I checked some of these, and a lot of them were false matches. So it searched for the phrase the Times, but these hit newspapers or other sources which included the Times within their title. So the Times of India, I think, was one of them, was a match. So too many false matches, so that wasn't useful. And then dimensions, it does have the London Times indexed. So when I searched for the Times, it gave me the London Times as a source, but it had only found 108 articles citing the Times. So that didn't work either. But the Web of Science does work. So if you want to search for citations to the Times in the Web of Science, so this is a paid bibliometric database, then if you go into the cited reference search, and for the cited work type in the Times, then it has a very high precision of getting exactly citations to the Times. So Web of Science have done the work of identifying specifically citations from to the Times. And if you want to find just citations from your university or a specific other university, then you can filter that way, as an example shown here. So in the web interface, you can select your university in the left-hand sidebar to refine the results to just from your university, if that's what you're interested in. Okay, so in the Web of Science, there were 22,000 documents citing the Times in the given year frame. So the Web of Science only allows you to download 10,000 records at a time. So you have to kind of you have to set up year-specific searches to split up the 22,000 into sub-searches, each with less than 10,000 matches, and then you can download them. So that's half an hour of work downloading the complete set. Or you can use the Analyze Results button in the Web of Science, and then this gives you an overview of information about the document citing the Times, the digital resource, the Times here. So from this quick tree diagram, we can see tree map. We can see that the subject area that most cites the Times is surprisingly government law. So I would have expected history to dominate this, but government law is the top one, then business, economics, social sciences, other topics, public administration, international relations. So there are lots of different subject areas that do cite old Times news stories. So, and if you want more detailed pictures, you could, and you're a bibliometrician, then you can use software like a VOS viewer. That's free, easy to use software to give you additional analyses. But I mainly used Excel, so I downloaded the resource into Excel and just to create simple graphs. So the report on the citations to the Times, this is the contents page of the report, just to give an idea of the kinds of information reported. And I'm just going to focus on chapter 4, but using the data downloaded from the Web of Science, the report included the main subject areas citing the Times, historical trends by subject areas, so which fields tended to cite the newer articles, which the older articles, and then the reasons for citing Times articles, which I'll go into a little bit more later. The journals that mostly cite it, the common themes among the citing articles, the institutions that mostly cited it, and the types of document that cite the Times. So all kinds of standard summary statistics, which I'm not going to show you because I think 4 is the most interesting. So I'll illustrate some of the themes for document citing the Times, and this is legal and social changes theme. So these are all documents academic documents that cite a Times story, an old Times story, for legal and social change reasons. So, for example, the first highlighted one is citing a Times story from 1847 called The Poor Law for Ireland. And it gives evidence that there was a petition in Glasgow in support of Ireland during the potato famine. So that was using the newspaper as a record for a relevant social activity, which might otherwise have gone unrecorded and unnoticed in the current day. And then the last highlighted one relates to the article, the Times story that we saw earlier. And the story was on women patrols, and it's it's evidence that women patrols were created near military bases to safeguard everyone concerned from the conduct of flighty women around about military bases. Okay, and then another completely different theme. Again, I was expecting history for this, but one of the themes was health. And the highlighted story is about smoking on trains. So now illegal, I think, around most of the world, but these were very early complaints that smoking took place on most of the carriages on trains in 1868. And this is a specific citation just to illustrate where it's from. So there's a paragraph of information about smoking on the railway, and then there's a citation number 454 is to the specific letter to the Times. So you can see that the Web of Science has identified that this footnote contains a reference to the Times newspaper, which is quite clever because it's not really cited in a very standard way. So I guess the Web of Science has picked up Times, London, England as meaning the London Times. And another example. So this was the global affairs theme, and this is the sub-theme of the Americas. So although it's the London Times, it's cited for global affairs many times. And the highlighted citation is about news coverage describing gold prospectors, white gold prospectors, as being very manly in the context of the gold rushes in California and British Columbia. So we can see that these are historical examples, but they're relevant to disciplines other than history. So I guess if you're studying history, then it's history of something, and whatever the of is probably a different field. So international politics, medicine, or society, social affairs. So that gives you another subject area that's interested in the Times. Okay, so the second case study is the 18th century collections online. So this is a collection of over 180,000 titles with a full text search, online search interface. And these are scanned printed works, mainly in English, also some other European languages. And they seem to be mainly books, but also other printed works. And the example at the bottom, a very odd document title, a catalogue of a very choice and curious collection of books in all arts, sciences and languages, is one of the resources, a very weird resource in there. So here we don't have periodicals. Every document has a different title. And initially for this, we hoped that when the resources were used, that the academics would cite 18th century collections online, which is the sole or the main source for all of these, but they very rarely did. So we had to search for them by title, by document title. Yeah, so the challenges were ECCO isn't mentioned in citations, and also ECCO isn't indexed as a source title in any major database. So there's not a simple way to find the searches as there was for the Times. And also the 180,000 documents, we can't search for them manually one by one. So we need an automated step. And the automated step was very simple, really. So we searched the in Scopus the reference lists for the title of the document. So if you want document citing a poem in praise of tea, then it's in Scopus, it's a cited reference, references search for the exact title in quotes. And if you want it for a single university, then you can add the ID of the university to the search, and then you just get hits from that university. And if you submit this to Scopus in the advanced search interface, then it should match, unless you've got a very general title, which you'll get too many false matches. So this is it in Scopus. So simple, and you can see 2 hits for this particular query. And the first one is a book, A Tale of Tea. Okay, so to do this for all of the ECCO documents, so we started off by filtering out the really generic titles. So we couldn't do much with documents which had a title like letter. So we filtered out the really short generic titles. And then, so we could have created, we could have combined these titles into multiple Scopus cited reference searches. So combine the different titles with OR. So that does work in Scopus, and it works very well in Scopus. And you could do that with Excel to speed up the process. And then you could submit these batches of queries to Scopus in the advanced search interface. So we didn't do this, but you could do this, and that would work if you didn't have an enormous number of documents, which we did. So then it would work like this. You would submit multiple queries at once. So that just speeds up having to submit 180,000 queries. But we use the programming version instead. So we use the Scopus's ability to submit queries through a program. So if you want to do this, you have to be have registered for Scopus, and then you can sign up to use the API at this URL. And that gives you permission to submit queries automatically, and then you can run as many as you like. So it looks pretty daunting to do this if you're not a programmer, but ChatGPT can write the program for you pretty well. So it doesn't take too long to do if you've got a little bit of experience with programming, or you can get someone to help you do it. And then manually check the results. So for this, we had to filter out titles that we thought originally were unique, but when we got the results back, they had enormous numbers of hits. So we had to filter those out and remove those from the results. And then we summarized them as for the Web of Science, and we used Excel and pivot tables for mostly for this again. But we could have used a bibliometric software like VosViewer. And an example of one of the results. So this is the poem in praise of tea that we saw earlier, and this is the source that's citing it. So this is reference number 11, and we can see that it's cited really well here, mentioning 18th century collections online. So this is the ideal perfect reference, but this was sadly very much an exception, with very few people mentioning the specific URL that you could find the resource at. But you can see how you can identify exactly why this poem was cited from the text of the containing the citation. So Cowper's poem emphasized the dual benefits of tea consumption. So you can see exactly why the poem was cited. So it could be anything. It could be any reason for citing this poem, but we can see exactly why it was cited to support an argument about gender commerce and the British slave trade debates. So an unexpected use for a poem about tea, I would think. So for ECCO, we did a similar analysis of lots of different aspects of the citing documents, so the subject areas citing the 18th century collections online, and then we looked at all the different reasons for citing these documents, an amazingly wide variety of different reasons for citing them. And then the commonly cited journals, commonly citing themes, and the countries and institutions, and the document types and years. So just a breakdown of the the broad context in which these documents are cited. So those are all in the report if you're interested to see that. So again, I'll go through the reasons for citing the rare documents, mainly just some of the reasons. So this example was a geography and travel. So again, we didn't expect anything about geography and travel in mainly English 18th century collections, but there was quite a lot. And the highlighted example is documents giving information about the architecture of storehouses in Damascus in the 18th century. And that was obtained from a passing reference, really, in a travel book, a compendium of travels of Frederick Lewis Norden through Egypt and Nubia, and just happened to mention the architecture of these storehouses, and that was used for an analysis in a published article. So it's really amazing how many different uses are found for these documents and how varied they are. And another example, interpersonal relationships. Lots of documents mentioned in interpersonal relationships, often plays or novels. And the highlighted one discusses the very real problem of men that have been cast off by rich wives or mistresses, being unable to find or afford nice clothes anymore. And it's in an article about the politics of male fashion criticism in the 18th century. So a fashion example, and well, fashion and interpersonal relationships, I guess. Okay, so to recap the six-stage method. So we started off by selecting resources with distinctive titles or other identifiers that we could find citations for. And then secondly, if we have periodical titles, then we can try and find a database that indexes the name so we can identify all the citations with a simple search. So that worked for the Times. And the alternative, when that doesn't work, is to search the reference lists of the documents, the references and footnotes of the documents, with a Scopus cited reference search. So reference, source, title, or reference, whichever works best. A little bit of trial and error here. And then you can submit these queries manually through the search interfaces, the web interfaces, if there are not too many documents, or automatically if there are a lot of documents, and that just takes a small computer program to do. And then step 5 is checking the results to filter out the false matches. So that might mean removing some of the documents that have too generic titles, or titles that overlap with titles of other documents. And then we saw that we can report the information in terms of lists of citations, which I haven't shown you, summary information like which subject areas mainly cite the documents, or running a content analysis of citations to really get to grips with exactly why these resources are used. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So the six-stage method, and then illustrated with the Times in the first case, and with the 18th century collections online in the second case. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got about this.
Thank you so much, Mike.
For listening.
We do have, we already have a couple questions that have come into the chat that we can get into. And if there's anyone else that has any other questions right now, you can feel free to put them into the Q&A. And then for anyone that wants to download the reports, there's the link on the screen now, and then they're also in the chat. Sabrina posted those direct links to the reports for both the Times and ECCO. The first question that came in earlier in the presentation is, do you have database suggestions for tracking citations to books coming from particular publishers? The commenter said they found Scopus is better for that than Web of Science or Dimensions. Did you have any thoughts on that for like particular publishers?
Yeah, I think Scopus does cover more books than the Web of Science, and I don't know Dimensions well enough to have an opinion on that. And they do cover by publisher, so it might be that one is better for one publisher and another better for a different one. So
okay.
and it could be that in the longer term, OpenAlex does better than the others in terms of books, because it is trying to be more inclusive, deliberately inclusive in the documents that it includes. But I don't know yet whether they'll really get the citations from the book. So I think OpenAlex covers more books, but I don't think it gets more citations from the books, because I don't think it has access to the full text. That might change in the future. So it's worth watching OpenAlex anyway, as well as
Okay.
Web of Science and Scopus.
That makes sense. And then this is another question from the same questioner is, does Web of Science actually use history as a subject, or is history part of that social sciences? This was, I think, when you showed that broad chart with the government being the number one and then social sciences being lower. Is history part of that social sciences, or does history have its own subject in Web of Science?
Oh, I don't know the answer to
That
this.
might be putting you on the spot on that one.
Yeah, so I use Scopus more than the Web of Science, so I don't know the answer. So history must be it might be in an arts and humanities category or a humanities category, but yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know.
I think just based on looking at the reports and the info that you sent me, I believe it is, because I think history would have another one. I just didn't see it represented, so I believe it is, but that we can confirm. The another question, this one's got a few upvotes. I think you answered this one, you maybe kind of in a bullet on one of the slides, is would the URL of a database show up in the citations? Is there a way to search the URL as part of, or search by the URL string? I don't know if you want to speak more on that.
Yeah, so it depends on the string, but so it's a little bit strange with URLs. So you're dependent on how the database that you're using splits up the URL. So
Yeah.
usually databases will split the URL up into segments, and then if you're lucky, one of the segment contains what you're searching for. So in my experience, it always works to search for the domain name in a URL, in a cited reference, but not always for other parts of the URL. So if there's an identifier within the URL somewhere, but it's not in the domain name, which it wouldn't be, then that might be tricky. So it might not be separated out and searchable in
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
It sounds like searching for those identifiers the same way you would in the titles, but within the URL a bit.
Yeah. So because the URL doesn't have any spaces in, the database doesn't know where to split them up for searching purposes. It might be worth trying wildcard searches. I haven't tried that. That might work with the URLs if you're just looking for an identifier within a URL.
That makes sense. And if anyone has follow-up questions on these, if I'm not asking specifics, feel free to please ask follow-ups. And we have another, you mentioned ChatGPT to help with the programming needed for some of these things. Can you, do you have any suggested prompts or kind of other tips for beginners getting started with the process using ChatGPT to do some of these things?
Yeah, sure. So one of the links in the slides takes you to a document which has a prompt for ChatGPT and the response from ChatGPT for writing a program, with also a program that will run the searches. So so I use ChatGPT a lot for programming, and I find that just describing what the task is as clearly as possible usually works. And the only thing you have to be careful of is it looking like it's working and giving you results, but the results not being correct. So you do need to check them. So it's so good at programming, specifically this type of programming. It's excellent at this type of programming. Which this for ChatGPT, this is a simple programming task. Whereas for a human, this is a horrible programming task because you have to read all the documentation for Scopus to find out the relevant bit. But ChatGPT loves that and just writes what program and works. You just have to check that it's not doing something silly like just getting you the first 50 results and not the rest. So it's
Mm,
so that's the thing to watch out for. But I haven't seen it do that for bibliometric searches yet, apart from OpenAlex. So for OpenAlex, it's made a mistake for me with only
okay.
getting a limited number of results and not the full set.
Okay. That makes
But
sense.
yeah,
And
just
yeah,
to,
I was just going to say, we'll share for the attendees, we'll share that PDF that has that link that Mike mentioned as well. So you'll have that, but I think that is solid chat GPT advice. The next is regarding this. This is regarding from David Hubbard regarding the 6-step method. How many of the Times articles found in Web of Science cited search results did not have article titles? And how effective, feasible, productive would a webometric approach have been for these types of publications if an article title was available?
yeah. So it was mainly based on the year, and I forget the cutoff year when the Times started to more systematically add titles to its stories. But I think they did in the 20th century, and sometime in the 19th century, they started to be more systematic or change their design style to have titles for most of their articles.
Oh,
But I don't know exact numbers. But I would imagine that most of the ones that I found did actually have a title.
okay.
But if you did title searches, then you would just find the more recent news stories and not the older ones. So it would be quite feasible to run specific title searches in Scopus, for example,
Mm-hmm.
for the more recent articles the more recent news stories that did have titles, because the titles tended to be quite long. So it
Okay.
would work for proper news stories, but it wouldn't work so well for letters to the editor, for example, which might just have letter to the editor as a title.
As the consistent, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and
Okay.
quite a few of those were cited.
That makes sense. Oh, and we do have an answer. Thank you, Anne. Benon. History is a category in Web of Science, so that
Okay,
is
okay.
good to know. Um, and this is a question. What is your opinion on the potential? It's an interesting kind of philosophical question. Is what is your opinion on the potential acquisitions of elitism in elevating academic journal citations as the best type of usage to be tracked by bibliometrics?
Okay, that's a tough question.
It's a little, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know if you want to take that one on today or
yeah, so I have an opinion, but I don't have any expertise on that. And my
okay.
opinion is that student users of these resources are incredibly valuable. So I didn't find any of those because a student citation to any of these resources wouldn't end up in Scopus or the Web of Science. So I wouldn't find them, but it must be incredibly useful for a student to learn about history, for example, or literature, or history of economics, or whatever, or history of health, through accessing primary sources, and reading the primary sources and getting first-hand information. So yeah, so I wouldn't say that citations are the best. I wouldn't have a strong opinion that citations are the best type of or the strongest users of these resources, because I think they must be very valuable for students as well.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective on that. Um, this is the next question is we have this study is meaningful for analysis in the library and digital primary source collection and perhaps being helping with collection development. Um, how do how I apologize. I'm really how does they do you see any in the impact in the your research, do you see any how the resource can impact student learning, i.e. better quality of research? Is there any way of tracking that, or do you GPAs, things like that in your research and the data that you're able to parse?
Yeah, and so I would love to be able to find that out. So I'm sure it has a positive impact, and I would love to have access to, for example, student projects or assignments, and see exactly what they're citing, and and I'm sure it would be evident that the students who'd cited the more diverse sources and the more primary sources had got a better learning experience and a better understanding of the material. I don't know of any studies that have done that. There might be some, but I don't know of any. It seems maybe it's too, to me it seems obvious that that would happen, but I'm not an expert
Yeah,
educator, so.
I think that's, yeah, maybe still in the anecdotal realm. The data is hard to get your arms around, but that'd be very interesting. I'm sure we would obviously be very invested in that type of information. Another question here is, how would you recommend, or what would you recommend are practical first steps for librarians who want to get involved in research evaluation of this kind?
Okay. So I would try out. So there are lots of books on bibliometrics if you want to learn the basics of bibliometrics, and um, I'm a hands-on kind of person, so I like to try things out and get some data and analyze it.
Mhm.
So I think there's no substitute for practical experience.
Just
Yeah.
getting in there.
Yeah, so a bit of theory from the books and online
Mhm.
resources to help you decide, to help you know which buttons to click in the databases, but also getting involved in small scale practical evaluations to start with, I think really helps you to get insights into the strengths and weaknesses of the different approaches and the available
Awesome.
tools.
Yeah. Then we have one more question on AI. Do you anticipate AI will reduce or increase the number of citations, assuming AI tools indicate the source?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I'm not sure. I don't have a strong feeling about whether there'll be an increase or decrease. So, if people rely, so I think people will be relying more and more on AI, and an issue will be the AI I think, is less likely to point you towards private sources. So
Hmm.
this is going to be a little bit of a problem um, for students that need to access private sources. So if they're relying too much on AI because it works for public sources, then
Yeah.
they're not going to be getting the best information. So this is maybe something for educators to take on board, remind students that this is an additional limitation of AI, that they can only process public information.
Hmm. That's a great, very interesting perspective. And then we have a couple more. How can library staff help spot or respond to scientific or any misinformation in their collections or online resources?
Um,
It might be
this is really a tough one. I don't know if, yeah. Um,
we can, that is a big one. How about we can do, we've got a little bit of time left. I think this is a better one for the end, is someone just saying, this has been fascinating. What is the most surprising result that you found from the 18th century collections online or the Times studies?
um, I think the most surprising result was that everything was surprising. So everything was like really
Interesting.
interesting and surprising. So I did have a favorite citation, which was there was a citation to a report of a meeting of the Jockey Club in the Times, and it reported a rule change in the Jockey Club in the 19th century, so that an English gentleman's club called the Jockey Club, and the Times reported its rule change, and that was cited as evidence that it was a really elitist club because you had to pay a lot of money to get into their rooms. And I don't know why that really tickles me, but I just think that's an
It's
odd. That I think maybe the thing that tickles me is I can't imagine how the author of the paper found that information in the Times.
Yeah,
So
they maybe just
yeah.
how did that get into that paper? That's very interesting. I love, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
I
so I
think
guess it's
that,
surprising that people find all this information in the Times, and
yeah, of like where, how one little piece of Times gets put into a paper with so many other sources is a fascinating thing in and of itself. Um, We do have one other thing to share. This is from Thane Chambers. Thank you for sharing this. For any Canadian listeners, they please join. They have a bibliometrics and research impact community of practice with several workshops and presentations for librarians. They put a link in the Q&A there for anyone to take a look at. I'll leave it in there. I'm not gonna in the open questions so people can check out that link. And then we do have there's one more question that just came in. And this one's a little, I will hand it over to you because it's beyond my technical expertise. Have you ever been able to use regex with any of these APIs? I kept thinking of \, the times, ampersand, / would help with disambiguation problems.
Yeah, I haven't tried regexes with the time, so I think so it might work to some extent. So the problem, the problem is that with the times, it's often cited as times, not the times, and then there might not be a comma or a full stop per period after the title, and then it goes into something else. So it'd be hard to have so regex is like a pattern matching device, and it'd be hard to find a pattern that closely matches the times and doesn't match in the main ways in which it's actually mentioned in citations, and doesn't match things like the times of India or the times of anywhere else, or
lots of different
but
things.
On the other hand, the Web of Science has probably done that for their indexing, so they've probably had someone spend a day building a complicated pattern matching to get the citations, so it must be possible.
I'm sure, yeah. It sounds like we'll have to have another technical, like a full technical run through on some of these things. I know there's probably a large number of data science librarians on here that are just chomping at the bit to learn a little bit more as well. Well, with that, I think we're kind of rounding out the hour. Ashley, if you want to, or Sabrina want to pull up that slide again, just so people can have those links to the impact studies. And just thank you, Mike, so much for your presentation and answering everyone's questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. On the webinar, you can read more about the studies that Mike has done at gale.com/research impact, where you can download both the studies. And then 18th Century Collections Online, part 3 is going to be coming out, which will expand the opportunities for research impact with these collections. So we're very excited about that. But thank you all for coming today, and the recording, I think Sabrina will probably mention that recording will be coming out, and we'll follow up with all the info that you need.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kevin. I'll just say thanks so much to Mike and Kevin for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording and where to access today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.